The concert hall buzzed with excitement that winter evening. Snow fell softly outside the tall windows of the Riverside Music Conservatory, but inside, the air was warm with anticipation. In the green room, a young pianist took deep breaths, her hands hovering over the fabric of her dark blue concert dress. She had been here countless times before. The star student, the one everyone whispered about in the hallways, the girl who could make the piano sing like no other. Tonight was supposed to be just another triumph. The winter recital was the biggest event of the season, with talent scouts from major orchestras sitting in the audience. Her teachers had already started talking about international competitions, about her bright future ahead. For the past 10 years, she had practiced 6 hours every day, perfecting every note, every movement of her fingers. Her mother used to say she was born to play the piano. Even as a toddler, she would climb onto the piano bench and press the keys with intense concentration, trying to copy the melodies she heard. By age 7, she was performing in local competitions. By 12, she had mastered pieces that many adult pianists struggled with. Now, at 21, she was the pride of the conservatory. The stage manager knocked on her door. 5 minutes, he called out. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the stage. The familiar butterflies danced in her stomach, but she welcomed them. They had always been part of her pre-performance routine. The grand piano waited for her under the spotlight, its polished surface gleaming. As she walked across the stage, she could hear the rustle of programs, the subtle shifting of bodies and seats, the collective intake of breath from the audience. This was her moment, one she had lived through hundreds of times. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands over the keys. The piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, her signature performance. She knew every note by heart, could play it in her sleep. The opening notes floated through the air, gentle and questioning, just as they should be. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the weight of expectations, heavier than ever before. Maybe it was the slight tremor in her left hand that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. As the piece built toward its first climax, she felt her fingers begin to slip. One wrong note, then another. The melody started to unravel like a loose thread being pulled from a sweater. Her heart raced. The more she tried to focus, the more the notes seemed to scramble before her eyes. The beautiful story she was supposed to tell through the music became a jumbled mess of sounds. She could hear the murmurs starting in the audience. Someone coughed, loud, deliberate, disapproving. Her hands were shaking now, visible to everyone in the front rows. The piece that had once felt as natural as breathing became an impossible mountain to climb. In the third row, her teacher covered his face with his program. A few rows back, someone was already filming with their phone. She knew what would happen next. The video would spread through music circles, her mistake dissected and discussed in practice rooms and online forums. The final section of the piece, usually a triumphant display of technical brilliance, became a desperate struggle to reach the end. When she finally played the last chord, the silence that followed was deafening. The applause, when it came, was scattered and polite, the kind reserved for failed performances. As she walked off stage, her legs barely holding her up, she could already hear the whispers following her. What happened? Did you see her hands? Such a shame. The backstage area, usually a place of celebration after her performances, felt like a long tunnel she couldn't escape fast enough. That night, as she lay in her dorm room staring at the ceiling, she knew something had broken inside her. The perfectly constructed world she had built around her music had shattered, and she had no idea how to put it back together. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she couldn't bear to read. Tomorrow, she would have to face everyone, her teachers, her fellow students, the whole music community that had placed such high hopes on her shoulders. But tomorrow felt like an impossible distance away. For now, in the darkness of her room, she let herself do something she hadn't done since she was a little girl. She cried, not delicate tears of disappointment, but deep, shuddering sobs that came from a place she didn't even know existed within her. The morning after the disastrous recital, she couldn't bring herself to check her phone. It lay face down on her bedside table, occasionally buzzing with messages she knew would be filled with either pity or judgment. Instead, she packed her bags in the gray dawn light, moving quietly like a shadow through her dorm room. Her roommate was still asleep, and she preferred it that way. No awkward goodbyes, no forced conversations about what had happened. The baby grand piano in her grandmother's apartment had been her childhood companion. Now, as she draped a white sheet over its gleaming surface, it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Her grandmother watched from the doorway, worry lines creasing her forehead, but knowing better than to interfere. The old woman had lived through enough of life's storms to understand that some journeys needed to be taken alone. "I'll find a job," she told her grandmother over a cup of tea that first morning. Something different, something normal. Her grandmother just nodded, sliding a plate of warm toast across the table. The kitchen was small, but filled with morning light, so different from the grand practice rooms she'd left behind. Here, no one expected her to be anything special. She found work at the Corner Cup, a busy diner 10 blocks away. The owner didn't ask many questions when she applied, just handed her an apron and showed her how to work the coffee machine. Her hands, once trained to dance across piano keys, now learned new rhythms, carrying plates, wiping tables, counting change. The regulars called her Honey and Sweetheart, never knowing they were addressing someone who had once played at Carnegie Hall. At first, she flinched whenever music played on the diner's radio. Her coworkers noticed how she'd freeze momentarily when classical pieces came on, but they assumed she just didn't like that fancy stuff. She never corrected them. It was easier this way, being nobody in particular, just another young person trying to make rent in the city. Her grandmother's apartment became her sanctuary. In the evenings, she would sit in the living room, deliberately facing away from the covered piano, watching old movies on TV or reading books she'd never had time for before. Sometimes, her fingers would tap against her leg, unconsciously playing pieces she'd spent years perfecting. She'd force them to stop as soon as she noticed. The video of her breakdown had gone viral within classical music circles. Former classmates sent links to articles with headlines like "Prodigy's Dramatic Fall" and "When Pressure Breaks Performance." She deleted her social media accounts and changed her email address. The only connection she kept to her old life was a small music box her first teacher had given her, hidden in the bottom drawer of her dresser. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, and with it, the street musicians returned to the city parks. She took different routes to work to avoid passing them. Her grandmother never pushed, but sometimes she would catch the old woman looking at the covered piano with a sadness that made her heart ache. One regular at the diner, an elderly man who always ordered black coffee and apple pie, once told her she had pianist's hands. She nearly dropped his coffee cup. "I just worked here," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But that night, alone in her room, she found herself staring at her hands. They were different now. A small burn from the coffee maker on her right thumb. A cut on her index finger from a broken glass. Working hands, no longer soft and protected. Her old life felt like a dream sometimes, or maybe a story she'd read about someone else. But late at night, when the city quieted and sleep wouldn't come, she could still feel the weight of piano keys beneath her fingers. In those moments, the music she'd spent her life pursuing haunted her like a ghost, both beautiful and terrifying. She kept the diner job, learned to make the perfect omelette, memorized her regular customers' orders, and slowly built a new routine. But sometimes, catching her reflection in the diner's window, she'd see two versions of herself overlapped. The confident performer in elegant concert dress, and the waitress in a coffee-stained apron. She wasn't sure anymore which one was real, or if either of them was. The sheet over the piano collected dust, and her grandmother never mentioned music anymore. But every now and then, When she thought no one was watching, she would stand near the covered piano, her hand hovering just above the sheet, almost but never quite touching it, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, both yearning to fly and afraid of falling. It happened on a Tuesday night, long after the dinner rush had ended. She was taking out the trash behind the diner, the heavy bags bumping against her legs as she pushed open the back door. The alley was usually quiet at this hour, just the distant rumble of subway trains and the hum of air conditioners. But tonight, something else floated through the humid summer air, the sound of a piano. At first, she tried to ignore it. For months, she'd gotten good at blocking out music, at pretending her heart didn't skip whenever she heard keys being struck. But this was different. The melody wasn't the precise, polished classical pieces she'd grown up with. This was something rawer, wilder, jazz spilling out of a basement window, notes bending and swaying like trees in the wind. She found herself following the sound, drawn despite her better judgment. The music led her to a narrow stairwell, descending to a basement-level door with peeling paint. A handwritten sign read "The Blue Note Room, live jazz every night." Through the door's clouded window, she could see the warm glow of stage lights. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. For the first time in months, curiosity was stronger than fear. Inside, the room was small and dark, with mismatched chairs scattered around tiny tables. The air smelled of coffee and old wood. On a small stage in the corner sat an upright piano, its wooden panels worn smooth by time. And at the piano sat an elderly man, his fingers dancing across the keys with a freedom she'd never seen before. She slipped into a chair near the back, still wearing her diner uniform. The old pianist didn't look up, lost in his own world of melody. His face was lined with age, his white hair catching the stage lights like a halo. But it was his hands she couldn't stop watching. They moved with such ease, such joy, as if the music was a conversation rather than a performance. When the song ended, only 3 people in the room applauded: herself and 2 others nursing drinks at the bar. The pianist turned toward the sound, and she noticed something she hadn't before. His eyes were clouded, unseeing. He played entirely by feel, by memory, by something deeper than sight. New hands clapping. He said into the dim room, his voice rough but warm. "Don't recognize those ones." He smiled in her general direction. "Come closer. Let's hear what kind of applause you've got." She found herself moving forward, drawn by something in his voice, an invitation without pressure, curiosity without judgment. Up close, she could see the piano better. It was nothing like the gleaming instruments she'd trained on, but it had character in its scratches and worn keys. "You're a pianist," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "I can tell by your footsteps. Too light, too measured, like you're always counting tempo in your head." The truth stuck in her throat for a moment before coming out. "I used to be." "Used to be." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound. "That's like saying you used to have fingers. Either you've got them or you don't." His hands found the keys again, playing a simple melody. "You don't stop being what you are just because you're afraid of it." She wanted to argue, to explain about the recital, the video, the shame. But he was already playing again, this time a familiar classical piece. But different, broken apart and reassembled with new rhythms, new life breathed into its old bones. "Pull up a chair," he said, patting the space beside the piano bench. "Let's talk about fear and music, and why they don't have to be friends." Something in her chest loosened, a knot beginning to unravel. She glanced at her watch. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago. Her grandmother wouldn't expect her for another hour. Without letting herself think too much about it, she sat down. "I don't play jazz," she said, the words coming out more defensively than she'd intended. He grinned, his unseeing eyes crinkled at the corners. "Good. Then you won't have any bad habits to unlearn. We'll start fresh." His fingers found a simple blues progression. Sometimes the best way forward is to try something completely new. Something where you can't possibly live up to anyone's expectations, including your own. The basement room was quiet except for the piano and the soft clink of glasses from the bar. Through the small window near the ceiling, she could see feet walking past on the sidewalk above, people going about their evening lives, unaware of the moment of change happening below their feet. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Names aren't important," he replied, still playing. "What's important is that you found your way here. Now, put your hands on these keys and let's see what happens when you stop trying to be perfect and just start being real." The first lesson was a disaster. Her fingers, trained for years in precision and control, refused to bend to the loose rhythms of jazz. The blind pianist just laughed, a warm, rumbling sound that echoed off the basement walls. "You're thinking too much," he told her. "Jazz isn't in your head, it's in your heart." Every Tuesday and Thursday night, after her diner shift, she would slip down those basement stairs. The Blue Note room became her secret world, hidden from both her past life of classical perfection and her present life of coffee orders and tip counting. Here, in the dim light and cigarette-scented air, she began to learn a new language of music. "Classical music is like a beautiful painting," her teacher would say, his weathered hands dancing across the keys. "Every brush stroke is planned, every color carefully chosen. But jazz?" He grinned, hitting a playful chord. "Jazz is like throwing paint at the wall and making art out of whatever pattern appears." She resisted at first. Years of training had taught her that every note must be precise, every rhythm exact. Jazz felt like walking on quicksand, everything shifting and changing beneath her fingers. But slowly, something began to change. The first time she hit a wrong note and her teacher nodded approvingly, she nearly stopped playing in confusion. "That's it," he exclaimed. "Now take that mistake and make it mean something. Wrong notes are just right notes in unexpected places." The regulars at the bar began to recognize her, offering encouraging nods as she practiced. An old man who always wore a battered fedora would tap his foot along with her attempts at swing rhythm, even when she stumbled. A woman with silver-streaked hair would close her eyes and smile, swaying slightly as the music filled the room. One night, struggling with a particularly challenging blues progression, she felt tears of frustration welling up. "I can't do this," she said, pulling her hands away from the keys. "I'm not good enough." Her teacher turned his unseeing eyes toward her. "Good enough for what? For whom? Music isn't a competition. It's a conversation. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes it's awkward, but it's always honest." He took her hands and placed them back on the keys. "Play me how you felt that night at the recital. Don't tell me. Play it." Her fingers trembled as they found the keys. At first, she started to play Chopin, the piece that had been her downfall. But then, something shifted. The melody transformed, becoming something new, darker, rawer, filled with the fear and shame she'd carried for months. Without realizing it, she began to improvise, letting the music tell her story in a way words never could. When she finally stopped playing, the room was silent. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses to listen. Her teacher smiled, a gentle expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Now that," he said softly, "was music." In the weeks that followed, she began to see music differently. The rigid structures she had built her life around began to crumble, revealing something more organic underneath. She started hearing jazz in unexpected places, in the rhythm of the subway cars, in the chaotic symphony of street noise, in the rise and fall of conversations at the diner. Her grandmother noticed the change first. "You're humming again," she said one morning over breakfast. "I haven't heard you make music in months." She hadn't even realized she was doing it. The covered piano in the apartment seemed to call to her differently now. It was no longer a symbol of failure and shame, but something waiting to be rediscovered. One evening, after a particularly good lesson, she found herself pulling the sheet off, dust motes dancing in the air like musical notes. Her fingers touched the keys hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The classical pieces she had memorized years ago were still there, but now they felt different. She found herself adding little variations, playing with tempo and rhythm in ways that would have horrified her old teachers. A neighbor's child, hearing the music through the walls, knocked on their door. "What are you playing?" the little girl asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "It sounds like a story." "It is a story," she replied, realizing the truth as she said it. "It's my story." And for the first time since that terrible night at the recital, she felt truly free at the piano. The music wasn't perfect anymore, but maybe she was beginning to understand. Perfect wasn't what music was supposed to be. The first time she played for an audience at the Blue Note Room, it was completely by accident. Her teacher had stepped away from the piano to take a break, and she was just noodling around with a simple blues progression they'd been practicing. She didn't notice the room getting quieter, didn't realize people were listening, until she finished and heard the scattered applause. Her face burned red, but it wasn't the same crushing embarrassment she'd felt at the recital. This was different, a softer, gentler kind of shyness. An elderly couple at the nearest table smiled warmly at her. "That was lovely, dear," the woman said, and somehow those simple words meant more than all the sophisticated praise she'd received in her classical career. At the diner, her coworkers started noticing changes in her. "You're different," one of them said while they were restocking sugar packets. "Lighter somehow." She just smiled, not ready to explain how she spent her evenings in a basement jazz club, learning to turn her mistakes into music. Her blind teacher began asking her to fill in when he needed breaks, just 10 or 15 minutes at a time. "Play whatever you feel," he'd say, patting her shoulder as he stood up from the bench. At first, she stuck to the simple pieces they'd practiced together, her hands shaking slightly under the dim lights. But gradually, something started to shift. She began to experiment, mixing elements of her classical training with the jazz rhythms she was learning. One night, she found herself playing a Beethoven sonata with a swing beat, and to her surprise, people in the club started swaying along. The regulars at the Blue Note Room became her first real audience since the recital. They weren't music critics or talent scouts, just people who came to enjoy music and escape their daily lives for a while. They didn't care about perfect technique or flawless execution. They cared about feeling something real. There was the taxi driver who always requested blues numbers after his night shift, saying the music helped wash away the stress of city traffic. The nurse who came in her scrubs during break time, closing her eyes and letting the music carry her somewhere else for a few precious minutes. The old man who never spoke but would tap his cane in time with the rhythm, a slight smile on his weathered face. Her grandmother finally came to hear her play one evening. Watching from the doorway, her teacher sensed something different in her performance that night. "You're playing for someone special," he said when she finished. When she described her grandmother sitting in the back of the room, tears glinting in the older woman's eyes, he nodded knowingly. "Family knows us best," he said. "They can hear our hearts in the music." The owner of the Blue Note Room started paying her a small fee for her playing. It wasn't much, just enough for taxi fare home and maybe a late-night sandwich. But it meant something. It meant she was a real musician again, not just someone hiding from her past. One regular, an amateur photographer, asked if he could take pictures during her performance for his portfolio. Her first instinct was to say no. The thought of being captured, being seen, still scared her. But then she caught her reflection in the old mirror behind the bar. She looked different now. Older, maybe, but also more real. More herself. "Okay," she said. "But make sure you get my hands in the pictures. They're telling a story, too." The photographs, when she saw them, caught something she hadn't realized was there. In one shot, her fingers were slightly blurred with motion, caught in the middle of a jazz riff. But her face was clear, peaceful, almost smiling. It was the face of someone who had found their way home by taking a completely different path. Her teacher kept the photographs on top of the piano, even though he couldn't see them. "I can hear what these pictures look like," he said, running his fingers over their surface. "They sound like freedom." The fear of failure didn't disappear entirely. It just changed shape. Instead of paralyzing her, it became more like an old friend sitting quietly in the corner of the room, reminding her that every mistake was just another chance to create something new. One night, after the club had closed and she was helping stack chairs, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she thought about that viral video of her recital disaster. The memory was still there, but it had lost its power. Like an old photograph fading in the sun, it had become just one small part of a much larger story. The news hit like a thunderbolt on a clear day. Her teacher hadn't been feeling well for weeks, but they'd all assumed it was just a cold that wouldn't let go. When he didn't show up for their regular Thursday session, she found him in the hospital. The doctors used words like serious condition and extended stay, but all she could think about was how still his hands looked on the white hospital sheets. "The club can't stay open without you," she said, sitting beside his bed. The Blue Note room had been running on tight margins for years, kept alive mainly by her teacher's nightly performances and loyal following. He turned his face toward her voice, smiling despite everything. "Maybe it's time to let it go," he said softly. "Everything has its season." But as she left the hospital that evening, walking past the closed club with its darkened windows, she couldn't accept that. The Blue Note room wasn't just a club. It was a sanctuary, a place where broken musicians could heal and find their voice again. She'd seen it happen not just for herself, but for others too. The saxophone player who'd lost his confidence after a stroke, the young drummer who'd been told she'd never make it, the retired music teacher who found joy in performing again. The idea came to her while she was working her diner shift, almost dropping a coffee pot when it hit her. A benefit concert. Not just any concert, but one that would bring together everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. Classical and jazz, tradition and innovation, fear and courage, all of it. Planning it was like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different sets. The club's regular crowd couldn't afford high ticket prices, but they needed to raise enough money to keep the place running. She spent her breaks between serving customers making calls, writing emails, reaching out to everyone she knew from both her old life and her new one. To her surprise, people wanted to help. The amateur photographer offered to create posters. The nurse who loved blues music had a sister at the local newspaper who agreed to write a story. The taxi driver knew someone who could print tickets at cost. Her grandmother insisted on baking cookies for intermission. But the real shock came when she checked her old email account for the first time in months. Her former classmates and teachers had heard about the benefit. Some of them were coming, not to judge, but to support. One of her old professors even offered to perform a duet with her. The night before the concert, she sat alone at the piano in the empty club. The space looked different now, transformed by fresh paint and borrowed chairs, donated decorations, and handmade signs. But the heart of it was still the same. The old upright piano with its worn keys, the slightly crooked stage, the memories soaked into every wooden beam. She played a few notes, letting them float in the darkness. For the first time in her life, she was going to perform without trying to be perfect. Instead, she was going to be honest about her journey, her struggles, her growth. She'd created a program that told her story. Classical pieces reimagined with jazz elements, traditional songs broken apart and put back together in new ways. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Her teacher was feeling stronger, and though he couldn't attend in person, the staff had agreed to help him listen to a live stream of the concert. "Play from your heart," his message said. "That's the only technique that really matters." As she locked up the club that night, a light rain began to fall. She thought about all the twists and turns that had brought her here. The recital that broke her, the diner job that humbled her, the basement club that healed her. Tomorrow, she would face an audience again, but this time as someone new. Someone who understood that music, like life, didn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. The posters around the neighborhood announced, "One night only. A classical meets jazz benefit concert to save the Blue Note Room." But she knew it was more than that. It was a chance to show that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead you to exactly where you need to be. Back in her grandmother's apartment, she didn't even try to sleep. Instead, she sat at the piano, no longer covered by a sheet, and played softly into the night. The music flowed freely now, a mixture of everything she was and everything she was becoming. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, she was just a musician telling her story through the universal language of music. The evening of the benefit concert arrived with a gentle summer rain that made the city streets gleam. By 6 o'clock, a line had formed outside the Blue Note Room, stretching around the corner. Regular customers mixed with conservatory students, local music lovers stood next to critics from the city papers, and her diner regulars chatted with professors from her old life. Inside, she paced the small back room, her concert dress swishing softly with each step. Through the door, she could hear the murmur of the growing crowd, the sound both familiar and strange. Her grandmother appeared with a cup of chamomile tea, wrapping her weathered hands around her granddaughter's trembling ones. "Remember," the old woman said softly, "you're not playing for them. You're playing for yourself and for him." They'd set up a tablet in her teacher's hospital room, ready to stream the entire performance. Somewhere in that sterile white room, he was waiting to hear her tell their story through music. At exactly 7:30, she walked onto the stage. The lights were warmer than she remembered from her classical concerts, softer somehow. As she settled onto the piano bench, she looked out at the crowd. In the front row, her coworkers from the diner wore their uniforms proudly. They'd come straight from their shifts. The old man with the fedora gave her a gentle nod. The nurse who loved blues was there in scrubs, having swapped shifts to attend. Her hands found their place above the keys, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then she began to play. She started with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece that had shattered her world at the recital. But this time, as the familiar melody filled the room, she let it breathe differently. Jazz rhythms crept in, subtle at first, then more boldly. The classical structure remained, but now it danced with something new, something uniquely her own. As she played, she felt the tension in the room shift. The classical purists in the audience leaned forward, perhaps ready to criticize, but then stayed, captivated by the way she wove the genres together. The jazz lovers nodded along, recognizing the soul beneath the technique. She wasn't just playing music. She was building bridges between worlds. Halfway through the program, she paused to speak to the audience. Her voice shook slightly, but grew stronger as she told them about the blind teacher who had shown her how to see music differently. About the little basement club that had become a home for lost musicians. About learning that sometimes you have to break apart completely to become who you're meant to be. The final piece was something entirely new, a composition she'd written herself. It began with the strict classical forms she'd grown up with, then gradually transformed, incorporating jazz elements, blues rhythms, even hints of pop music. It was her whole journey in musical form, every wrong note and right note, every tear and laugh, every fall and rise. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured kind she remembered from concert halls, but something raw and real and joyful. People were standing, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Later, she would learn that someone had filmed the performance and shared it online. Just like that first viral video of her breakdown, this one spread quickly through music circles. But this time, the comments were different. This is what music is supposed to be. She's reinventing the rules. I've never heard anything like this. The conservatory reached out the next day, offering her a teaching position. They didn't want her to teach just classical piano. They wanted her to create a new program. one that would break down the barriers between musical genres. But she had one condition. She would continue playing at the Blue Note Room twice a week, keeping the connection to where she had found her true voice. Her teacher recovered enough to return to the club a month later. The first night he was back, they played together, his jazz expertise dancing with her classical training in a duet that had the audience spellbound. "You found it," he said afterward, his unseeing eyes bright with joy. "The thing every musician searches for, your own sound." That night, after everyone had gone home, she sat alone at the piano in the empty club. Her fingers moved across the keys, playing nothing in particular, just letting the music flow. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the perfect prodigy to the humiliated failure to whatever she was now. Something new, something real. The sheet music on the piano was a mix of classical scores and jazz charts, some marked up with her own notes, others dog-eared from use. But she wasn't reading any of them now. She was just playing, letting her heart speak through her hands. And in the quiet of the empty club, with the street lights casting long shadows through the windows, she realized that she had finally found what she'd been looking for all along, not perfection, but freedom. Not just music, but her music. The Blue Note Room thrived after that night. It became known as a place where boundaries didn't exist, where classical met jazz met blues met soul, where mistakes were celebrated as opportunities, and where every night something new and beautiful was being born. And at the center of it all was a pianist who had learned that sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead you to exactly where you're supposed to be.